Hello and welcome to Crime Watch Daily Updates. I'm your host, Anna Garcia. George Young was a hardworking family man who often shadowed Atlanta celebrities as their bodyguard. Though he dedicated his work to protecting other people, a twist of fate on a November night left him without the one thing he promised his clients: safety. On November 17th of 2017, George returned home from work and was gunned down as he walked in his front door. George's wife, Tia, told police she thought George's death was part of a gang initiation, but detectives didn't buy that. Neither did George's family. Investigators also became suspicious of Tim Lee, a man Tia initially referred to as her brother, but it turns out he was anything but that. George hired Tim to work for his security company, and he even told Tim to move in with him and his family because Tim was living out of hotels. Soon enough, Tim and Tia started having an affair. During their investigation, police learned George had a $1 million life insurance policy with Tia as the beneficiary. Police believe Tia had her husband of 22 years, the father of her 3 children, killed so she could cash in on the policy and start a new life with the other guy. The two were eventually arrested and charged with George's murder. On April 6th of 2019, Tia was convicted of felony murder, aggravated assault, and 2 counts of criminal attempt to tamper with evidence. She was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole. A jury found Tim guilty of malice murder, felony murder, and aggravated assault. A judge sentenced him to life in prison without parole. Let's take a look back at the case of a dedicated father who was killed by 2 people he trusted.
A bodyguard to the stars, stopped dead in his tracks by a sniper lying in wait.
He dropped his iPad, his papers and things were all right there at the door.
But who'd want to murder the beloved husband and father?
My heart just bleeds for my children as a mom.
The search for a cold-blooded killer would expose dark family secrets.
They didn't want the kids to catch on.
And leads to 2 shocking arrests.
I couldn't believe it.
This selfie is the last photo George Young would ever take. The busy bodyguard was working as usual.
He was doing security, armed security for a high-profile celebrity.
The gig protecting rapper Lil Yachty wasn't George's first assignment of the day. Ivy Barnhill says 12-hour workdays were the norm for her big brother.
My brother worked a lot. He worked 70 hours a week. He worked really hard to provide for his family.
In addition to his job installing security alarms, George had started his own business, providing security for celebrities in Atlanta.
We were all very proud of him for what he had accomplished, and he was proud of himself.
In mid-November, after leaving the rapper's clothing line launch in an Atlanta mall, George headed home to his family in nearby Beaufort.
It was very quiet, very clean, street lights. It was in a very good area.
But around 11:30 at night, the silence of suburbia was shattered by gunfire, just as George reached his front door. The proud father of 3 is shot twice.
He got shot from the side. His keys were actually in the door when he was shot and killed.
Inside, his wife Tia, who was upstairs in her bedroom, is startled by the sounds. This is what she told our Atlanta affiliate CBS 46 just hours after the murder.
I heard 2 loud gunshots. At first I thought it was gunshots, but I wasn't sure what it was. I didn't know if it was firecrackers.
Tia tells cops her brother Tim grabbed his shotgun and went outside to investigate.
At that point, she didn't know who it was or what was going on.
Gwinnett County Police Detective David Smith says that was about to change.
You still hear on the 911 call, he comes back in and tells her it was her husband.
Police and paramedics raced to the Youngs' home on Montauk Hill Drive, but it was too late. Amanda Coyne covered George's murder for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution.
When the EMTs arrive, they say that George has already died.
Detective Smith is one of the first investigators to arrive.
I see the victim laying on the steps just off the front porch. Of course, there's blood pooling there.
His immediate reaction to the crime scene:
this has to be some kind of ambush. He had no idea this was coming because the way his hands were, it's like everything just immediately dropped when he was shot.
The loud cracking pops of gunfire brings neighbors out to check on all the commotion.
People were very shocked. This is not a neighborhood that something like this occurs.
Cops quickly rule out robbery as a motive.
His wallet, phone, and everything were still on him, so they didn't take anything.
No weapon is found, but a shell casing is recovered.
When CSI got there, they combed the area. They used metal detectors to try to find the other one.
The second casing is never located.
The reason why we couldn't find the second shell casing was kind of weird to us. There wasn't many places it could have gone.
Detectives questioned George's grieving wife of more than 20 years, along with her mother and brother, who also lived with the family.
No one had any explanations or details to provide us that sent us in a certain direction.
A couple hours after the killing, George's sister Ivy is awakened by her husband, who delivers the tragic news.
He's like, "It's your brother." And I said, "What about my brother?" And he said, he's been shot. I said, "Okay, well, is he okay? What happened?" You know, he said, "No, babe, he's not okay. He's dead." And I just started screaming.
Ivy still lived in South Carolina with the rest of her family. Within hours, she was on the road, heading to Georgia, texting Tia along the way, trying to get answers.
She told me that that the police thought it was mistaken identity. She said it could have been gang related, like a gang initiation type thing.
None of it was making sense to Ivy.
I'm not saying that, you know, bad things like that can't happen in good neighborhoods, but it was a very nice, quiet neighborhood, and as many times as I visited, I never felt unsafe.
And Ivy wasn't the only one surprised.
Why someone would be, we consider to be ambushed on their front porch like that.
Especially targeting someone like George Young.
He was a really good guy. Everybody loved George. Everybody. Real friendly, likable personality. Would do anything for anybody.
Everyone that we talked to, he was such a good man. All he did was work. He was working so early in the morning till late at night.
Immediately, cops wonder, could the murder be tied to George's work, doing security detail for celebrities? Did something happen at his job that night with rapper Lil Yachty?
Did he get into an argument with someone and they followed him home? It just didn't seem random at all.
But after a few phone calls to his colleagues, that theory was tossed.
All the information we were getting while on scene was the night had gone great. He'd even told the person he was on the phone with on the way home that everything had gone really well and there hadn't been any issues.
So who'd want to kill George Young, and why? George Young had built a successful business protecting celebrities. But on the night he needed protecting, no one was there. Just a cold-blooded killer. The loving husband and father of three gunned down on his front porch.
We really didn't have anything to go on right away.
Everyone cops talked to loved George.
They kept saying no one would want to hurt him. There's no reason anybody would try to do something like this.
Neighbors in their quiet Atlanta suburb were shocked, especially after hearing the shooting could be part of some kind of gang initiation.
That was actually raised as a question by his wife in an interview the day after he was killed, was that maybe it could have been a gang initiation.
It's the same story Tia Young told George's sister Ivy.
At first I was buying her story.
Ivy may have been buying it, but Detective David Smith found the idea suspicious.
We did not provide any kind of gang explanation or mistaken identity. That's not something we see a lot, especially in something like this. Not in that neighborhood either.
It was just the beginning of explanations from Tia that would raise eyebrows.
Things just stood out to me immediately.
The night of the murder, cops questioned Tia and her brother Tim Lee. Both were inside the house when George was killed.
I expect them not to be able to remember everything, especially the first time. But their stories just didn't seem to add up, especially that short amount of time had only passed by. They couldn't get their stories together.
Tim tells cops when he heard the gunshots, he grabbed his gun and went outside. When he saw George bleeding to death, he put his gun away and called Tia.
And Tia's story was that she came out of the bedroom, went to Tim's room, he wasn't there, and then she came downstairs and asked him if he heard that, and then he went to go check him.
Cops say there's a problem with both of those stories.
None of that took place on the 911 call.
During the 911 call, which police have not released to the public, Tim is actually overheard telling Tia that George had been shot. And there was something else suspicious about her call. Remember this?
I thought it was gunshots, but I wasn't sure what it was.
When Tia first called 911, she told the operator the sound outside could be firecrackers because her neighbors are always setting them off.
Again, to me, that says this is something you hear all the time, so why is today the day that you're going to call police when you're accustomed to hearing this noise?
Cops were starting to grow even more suspicious of Tia, and they weren't the only ones.
I just felt like it was weird, and I didn't really like it. I didn't like what I walked into and what I saw.
After driving 6 hours from South Carolina, George's sister Avi arrived at his house expecting to find Tia an emotional wreck.
I was around her when her father passed, so I knew how she grieved.
But she claims what she found wasn't a grieving widow at all.
And she greeted me like with open arms, like, "Hey, Iv," and gave me a hug, and no tears, no nothing. And I couldn't believe it.
Ivy says no one at her brother's house seemed upset.
Everybody just seemed like, like he was on a vacation, not that he had been murdered. It just didn't, no one was mourning. And I'm not to judge who, how people mourn, but no one was really crying or anything like that.
If things at her brother's house seemed unusual, they were about to get even more bizarre when Ivy saw this report on the local news.
Her brother opened the front door of their home and found George collapsed on the porch. He ran back inside and told his sister to call 911.
And I was like, brother?
Ivy says Tia doesn't have a brother.
And then another outlet said she referred to him as a cousin. I mean, he's not related to her. He's not related to us at all.
Even before leaving South Carolina, Ivy says she was already suspicious of Tim Lee. It started when she heard George had been killed and frantically tried reaching Tia at the house by phone.
Timmy picked up the phone and answered. And I said, "Who is this?" And he said, "It's Timmy." I said, "Why are you there and why are you answering her phone?"
Ivy says Tim grew up in the same town as she and George, but they were never close friends.
He was very quiet, kind of weird.
Tim tells Ivy when he lost his job, George hired him to work security for his company. Then, when George found out Tim was living in hotels, he invited him to move in with his family.
For a grown man that's not related to us to be living in the house was shocking. And it was shocking to me that he never mentioned it to me. I just felt like, what's the big secret?
Ivy's shock at learning Tim lived with her brother's family was about to get a whole lot worse. When she arrived at his house, she claims Tim and Tia were in his bedroom with the door closed.
She came out of the room. That was my first inkling. And then her reaction, like no tears, no nothing. That just made me feel like something's not right.
Ivy claims the longer she stayed at her brother's house, the more uneasy she felt about Tim and Tia's relationship.
She would hang out in Timmy's room more than she would hang out in the room that her and my brother shared. One time I walked by the room and she was in his room charging her phone, sitting on this futon that he had in his bedroom. She seemed very comfortable in there. Like there was candles lit, like soft music playing.
Detectives first learned that Tim and Tia were not really related when they were both brought in for questioning 2 days after the murder.
It was alarming to me.
And that wasn't the only alarm for cops. 2 days after George Young was gunned down on his front porch, his wife Tia and family friend Tim Lee are brought in for questioning.
The story still continued to change.
One of the biggest reveals, Tia tells cops that Tim isn't really her brother. He's just a family friend who needed a place to live.
To us, that was a big deal. Like, before, this is what you had said, and now he's not your brother.
And their stories about what happened the night of the murder are shifting.
She began to add things that didn't make sense. When we spoke with Tim, it was the same thing. The story was not the same about when they saw each other. Now he had done things that he hadn't mentioned before.
The interviews would soon give the cops the break they needed. A bombshell coming from the Youngs' next-door neighbor.
We were in the middle of the interview, and when we took a break and came out, another detective had just left and called us and said, "Hey, this is what he just told us."
The neighbor says immediately after hearing gunfire that night, he looked out his window and saw who he believed was Tim. He was running from the Youngs' home to George's Lincoln Navigator parked in the driveway. The neighbor claims he watched the man remove something from the SUV, then run back inside. Detectives returned to the interrogation room and asked Tim about it.
We asked him, you know, did you ever go out to the car for some reason? And he said, okay, I know where you're going with that. And he says, I was getting the tracker off the car. And so immediately we're like, what are you talking about? What do you mean you took a tracker off the car?
Tim claims George asked him to place a GPS tracker on his truck for safety.
In case something were to ever happen to him, that they would be able to find the vehicle.
But if George had really asked Tim to put a tracker on his truck, why the rush to remove it after the murder?
You took the time to step over his body, not offering aid to him, and your first thought was to go get the tracker. And he said, well, it was just my first instinct because I wanted to protect George.
Protect George from what? He'd been shot and was bleeding to death on the porch.
He's like, I didn't want anyone in the family or friends to find out so they wouldn't think anything negative about him.
Tim then tells cops George had been running guns from Florida to North Carolina, and a man involved had come looking for him.
That guy had come to the house and visited them and told Tia that George owed him money.
Could that man really be the killer? When cops asked Tia about the shady dealings, the elaborate story falls apart.
She had no idea what we were talking about.
That made me very upset because I felt like they were trying to defame his character, and I knew that wasn't true.
When cops returned to the Youngs' home to pick up the tracker, Ivy pulls Detective Smith aside, unknowingly exposing yet another major crack in Tim and Tia's story.
I told him that, I knew that there was an insurance policy, and I felt like maybe that had something to do with it, but I wasn't sure.
Detectives were stunned. Just hours earlier at the police station, Tia told them she didn't believe there was a life insurance policy.
There had been in the past, but to her knowledge, they had lapsed.
They soon discovered that not only was there a $1 million policy, Tia was the sole beneficiary, and she had already called the insurance company to process the payout.
They had recorded phone calls where she had called less than 24 hours right after the murder.
It was all adding up, but Detective Smith says Tia's 13-year-old son also unknowingly exposed yet another of his mother's lies. It stems from the 911 call the night of the killing. Here's an interview she gave to our Atlanta affiliate, CBS 46.
And I begged, when I called 911, I begged them not to turn sirens on because I didn't want my kids to see him like that.
The Youngs' 3 sons didn't see their father like that. Amazingly, cops say they slept through all the commotion.
We were in and out of their rooms doing searches. We were talking to everyone, the medical examiner, the fire trucks, ambulances, police, CSI taking pictures, neighbors coming outside. Everyone woke up but the kids.
Detectives believe they know why.
She had been giving him Unisom sleep pills.
Tia admits giving one of her sons sleeping pills in the past to help him stay asleep at night. The boy told cops he hadn't had one for a month, until the night of his father's death. However, that's not what his mom said.
With my interview in Tia, she stated that she had been giving it to him several nights that week, and he said that that wasn't true.
Cops suspect the night of the killing, Tia gave all her sons a sleeping pill.
Obviously, we know the middle one had taken the pill willingly, but our theory may be that they had all been given that pill that night.
Tim and Tia quickly became the prime suspects in George's murder, and not just in the eyes of detectives.
I said, I think you and Timmy killed my brother.
2 days after arriving in Georgia, Ivy made the bombshell accusation to her sister-in-law.
I watched every move that she made. She definitely had something to hide.
Investigators suspected the same thing, but needed more evidence before making an arrest. Much of it they'd find on Tim and Tia's cell phones.
Kind of all began to unravel from there.
Cops say the night George was killed, Tim was tracking his every move, using the GPS tracker he'd placed on his truck and an app on his phone.
So we knew he was the only person that would have known when he was coming home.
In addition to the life insurance money, investigators also uncovered what they claim is another motive for murdering George.
Tia did not want to be with George anymore.
Despite what she told cops, friends and family say Tia and George's marriage was on the rocks, and there was plenty of proof of that on her phone.
The texts between Tia and Tim were very romantic. They were sexual. They were something that you would send to your boyfriend or your girlfriend, your husband or your wife, but definitely not your brother.
With evidence mounting against Tim and Tia, in April they were both brought back into police headquarters for questioning. Cops immediately ask about their relationship.
I put some explicit emails that she had sent to Tim down in front of her.
Tia admits to having an affair with Tim. She claims it stopped after the murder. but had started back up again.
She was ashamed of it, but she thought George was in a relationship.
Investigators say they found no evidence George was having an affair or that he knew his wife was.
I don't think he would think the person that he opened his home up to and gave a job would ever do anything like that to him or would betray him in that way.
Unlike Tia, Tim wouldn't admit to anything.
Tim did stop and request a lawyer once I confronted him about the relationship.
After the interrogation, Tim and Tia were both arrested and charged in connection with the murder of George Young.
They've both been charged with malice murder, felony murder, and aggravated assault.
Cops allege Tim and Tia conspired to kill George for the life insurance money, and so they could be together. They claim the emotion Tia showed in TV interviews following her husband's death was all an act.
I'm gonna do it by myself. He was a really good guy. Everybody loved George. Everybody.
Detective Smith believes Tim Lee either hired someone to actually pull the trigger or did it himself.
I think that it's more likely he did it, just because of the time frame. I think he came out the back door, came and hid in the bushes. Once he shot George, he went back in through the back door.
George's sister Ivy believes the same.
I feel like he weaseled his way into that house and just wreaked havoc, and I do blame him. Out of the two of them, I'm more angry at him, but I'm disappointed in her.
In court, the couple pleaded not guilty. The judge refused to grant bail, keeping them behind bars until their trial. Detective Smith is confident they'll be found guilty.
This is not a case where there's just a few things that made us feel like they were involved. It was constantly coming back to them.
As for the $1 million life insurance policy, Tia has not collected a cent.
Once the insurance company learned that she was a suspect, they hold that money and they will not let that money out until there is a conviction or they learn what's going to happen in court.
Since their mom's arrest, Tia's 3 sons have been staying with their mother. Ivy hasn't seen her nephew since early December. Tia cut her out of their lives for accusing her of murder.
I'm here whenever they need me. They know I go hard for them. So as soon as they call me and say, Ivy, I need this, I need that, I'll be there. And I'm going to do everything in my power to take care of those boys because they mean a lot to me.
As for this sister-in-law she once looked up to, if Ivy could talk to Tia today,
I would tell her that I love her, but I'm very disappointed in her. I feel betrayed. I want them to know that my brother was a very good man. My brother loved Tia. He worshiped the ground she walked on, and he did not deserve this.